Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about what killed WCW episode, or who killed WCW, I'm sorry, episode 1. So, if you've seen all of the WWE documentaries on WCW, if you read Guy Evans' book on WCW, you already know the answer to this question. Who killed WCW? AOL Time Warner. When they merged, they got rid of WCW because the executives hated it. The problem with WCW that people don't seem to understand is that all the villains were already on the inside. The executives hated it. The talent didn't care. It's that simple. The executives hated it from the beginning, and the talent didn't care. I mean, what more do you need to know? You know, I get that we need to, every once in a while, beat this dead horse of WCW. But the answers have been standing in front of us so many times. Guy Evans wrote a really great book, incredibly detailed on WCW. I think that this documentary is going to end up being the documentary form of that book, Nitro. And looking at some of the players that they got in this thing, you know, Brad Siegel literally being in here tells us a lot. And I really like that. I really enjoyed that. That element is going to make it worth watching. That they're going to have some different kinds of talking heads in the documentary. That's going to make it interesting, but the outcome is still going to be the same. The enemies were on the inside. The enemies were the people wearing suits and ties. They did not like WCW. Now, in the episode, they started with the who killed WCW stuff, and there's various people pitching ideas. The guy holding the checkbook, which is Bischoff, the talent, the Turner executives. All these other people are being blamed. Vince Russo is being blamed. All these people are being blamed. So everybody recognizes that, you know, the villain is on the inside. But something as simple as, hey, when Bischoff, and look, Bischoff gets a lot of heat in this thing. He gets a lot of heat in general. Bret Hart at the end of the show talks about Eric Bischoff not knowing anything about wrestling and only being a prop for Hulk Hogan. I am going to cape for Eric Bischoff. So I found a reason why I need to do this review. Eric Bischoff was one of the only people who legitimately gave a damn about WCW. 3 people cared about WCW genuinely. One was Ted Turner, because Ted Turner built his network around wrestling. That was what he cared about. He liked wrestling. He was a wrestling fan. He had, without him, the show wouldn't have gotten as far as it did, because he's the boss. Right? The executives hate the show, but there's nothing they can do about it because Ted Turner is the boss and he wants it to work. So without Ted, you got no WCW in the first place. So obviously he's number 1 when they talk about who cared about WCW. And number 2 is Bill Shaw. Bill Shaw is the guy who Ted Turner hired and told him, you need to turn WCW into a profit-making venture. That's your job. And so Bill Shaw has to care. If he cares about his job, he has to make sure WCW works. So he has all the incentive in the world to care about WCW. He doesn't, probably not emotionally invested in the product, but he cares about the product because he wants to not lose his job. And the number 3 is Eric Bischoff. The only guy who is at that level, who gave a damn about WCW, that was actually into the wrestling business. And this whole thing, this episode, goes through the story of Eric Bischoff, from Ninja Star Wars to him meeting Vern Gagne, to him becoming the vice president of WCW, to him taking over creative and all that kind of stuff. That's pretty much the entire breadth of this episode. It's well-worn territory. I don't need to go into any details. Bischoff, to me, is the guy who borrowed some good ideas, stole some good ideas, generated some good ideas to make this company work. For him to be blamed for why the company went out of business when he was the only people who cared about it in the first place is absolutely absurd. It is absurd. Oh, but Bret Hart said it, so Bret must be right. Bret's right about everything. Look, yes, Bischoff was a puppet for Hulk Hogan. But if it wasn't for Eric Bischoff playing puppeteer for Hulk Hogan, you wouldn't have had WCW that high in the first place. Case in point, 1994, WCW was in the goddamn toilet. Bischoff gets control of the company. His first thing is to bring in Hulk Hogan. But Hulk Hogan is paranoid. You know, he was paranoid from his days of working with Vern Gagne, and Vern Gagne was changing the nature of contracts. He was changing finishes. He wants a cut of his merchandise, all that crap. Then he goes to work for Vince. That becomes a really booming business. But he works with Vince. Him and Vince, they got a simpatico, but they have a thing near the end. Vince thinks Hulkamania is over. Hogan's like, wait a minute. His ego won't let him say that. So they separate. They part ways. Hogan's off making movies and television shows and all that kind of crap. Bischoff has to find a way to get Hulk Hogan to join up with his company. Hulk Hogan is still the biggest wrestler on planet Earth at the time. All right? There's just no doubt about that. There's nobody who was a bigger star in 1994 than Hulk Hogan. So it's the right decision for Eric Bischoff to say, I need to bring Hulk Hogan in. What do I need to do? So they had to go through about 18 months of Dungeon of Doom garbage, because that's what Hulk Hogan wanted. Had to bring in his friends like, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Booty Man and all these weirdos, the Nasty Boys. Bring all these guys in because that's what Hogan wants. Hogan gets creative control because that's what he wants. But once they got the trust of Hulk Hogan, it was those guys. It was Bischoff and the guys that he trusted. And it was Hogan who said, all right, you guys know my business inside and out. I've trusted you guys so far. You haven't led me astray. You want me to turn heel, sacrifice my merchandise and my sponsorships and my movie roles and all this kind of stuff I want to do. You want me to sacrifice all of that on the chance that this thing could work. Yes. And it's because it was Bischoff and all these glad-handing guys that it worked in the first place. Hogan would not have done it any other way. I mean, how many times do they basically have to tell you? I know Hogan lies. Hogan lies. All he do is lie. All right? He lied and started talking about, oh yeah, I knew Hulkamania. They're booing me, brother. It's like, they were booing you in the WWF. You're in denial. In 95, 96, you were in denial about the power of Hulkamania. It took for somebody that he trusted to step up to him and say, Hulk, we got an idea. We got a ball rolling here. In this documentary, Bischoff says that Hogan called him on the phone to say he wanted to be the third man after Bischoff had done all the work of convincing Sting. I'm pretty sure I heard a different story, because I've heard these stories 100 times. I'm pretty sure I heard something different before, that Bischoff begged and pleaded, trying to get Hogan to do it, because it wouldn't have made sense for it to be Sting in the first place. Yes, they kind of planted the seeds for it to be Sting, where Sting got upset and basically quit WCW on television because he kept getting questioned. So that was one of the things where they planted the seeds just in case it was going to be Sting. But it was going to be Hogan the whole time. That was the plan. But it was because of Bischoff and all these glad-handers that WCW was successful as it was for as long as it was. Because if it wasn't for Bischoff, Hogan never would have turned heel. He wouldn't even been in the company in the first place. To say that Bischoff doesn't know anything about wrestling, I don't know how you can say that with a straight face. He doesn't have to know a lot. He knew enough to get where he was. I'm not saying that he was goddamn Bill Watts or anything like that, but he knew enough about wrestling. And he had a different vision for wrestling. And this is something else he talked about in the documentary that, Bischoff talks about quite a bit on his podcast, is when you have a product like professional wrestling, people have a perception of it. And they talked about it in here that pro wrestling had a perception of being an arena product, that people go to see the show live. But there was two people who said, we need to turn pro wrestling into a television show. Those two people, Ted Turner, Eric Bischoff. So there it is. You got the two guys who cared the most about the company, who had a different vision of what pro wrestling should be, or at least what this product should be. And they executed that idea, vision. Ted Turner opened the lanes so that Bischoff can move in it and not have to deal with all the sharks in the executive branch who didn't want him to do anything and didn't want the company to exist. Ted Turner was able to clear all those people out. He forced WCW onto Brad Siegel, who is in the documentary repeating things that he said to Guy Evans and that we already knew, that WCW was downscale. It was too Midwestern. It was too Southern. If you don't know, they hate flyover country. So unless you're from like Los Angeles or New York, they hate you. I won't know how many times you got to tell people that. And that, they wanted TNT to be a high grade network, a premium brand, a prestige network and all this kind of stuff. And WCW was antithetical to that. They didn't want WCW on the network at all. So in order to get Brad Siegel to have some level of buy-in when it comes to WCW, they said, okay, we're going to put it on Monday night, 8 o'clock, exactly opposite USA Network's #1 show. You want to be #1, you compete with the #1 show. You put on a similar product, you split the audience, and with Bischoff doing the new things that he's doing, like making a product live, doing the invasion storyline, doing more realistic takes on wrestling, while also keeping it pro wrestling, then you can compete. So that gives Brad Siegel some level of buy-in. And also, because unlike Bill Watts, who was a 100% wrestling guy, Bischoff is more of a 60-40 television guy. He came from being an announcer. He was not a wrestling promoter, So for him, he wanted to make it a television product. And that is the key to success, because people are watching a TV show. All right. So without Bischoff, how does this thing work? Without Bischoff and Ted Turner, how does this thing work? How could you sit back here and blame Eric Bischoff for killing WCW? It was ripped out of his hands multiple times before the company even went out of business anyway. But we haven't gotten that far in the documentary series yet. To say that he didn't know what he was doing because he gave Hogan creative control, I think that was a fatal flaw that ended up hurting the company in the long run. But in the short run, you don't have the highest highs without Bischoff giving Hogan creative control. You don't have Hogan there without Hogan getting creative control. When you actually look at what Hulk Hogan's contract was, with a certain amount of days he had to work and, a certain amount of percentage he had to get paid off pay-per-views, all that stuff was very excessive. It was detrimental to the company in the long run. But in the short run, just to get him to sign up, it was all he could do. Again, Bischoff is competing with Vince. Hogan could have took some time off, turned around, went right back to WWE in 1996. Instead, he went to WCW because Bischoff, he played the game. He didn't have any leverage against Hogan. Hogan doesn't know who he is. It's a rival wrestling promotion. He's got to give in certain things in order to get Hogan to sign up. That's how negotiations work. Who has the leverage? Who has the control? It's not just about, can you offer him X amount of dollars? Because it's not always about money. It's about money and sometimes ancillary things. Hogan wanted to make sure that his character was protected. He wanted to make sure that he didn't look like a goof on television. He wanted to make sure he could make as much money as possible in this deal. And a lot of this stuff was, and when they say, Hogan was being selfish, it's like, yeah, Hogan was being selfish. Of course he was. Everybody's selfish to a degree. Nobody cared about Hulk Hogan being selfish when, there was 40,000 people in the Georgia Dome. Nobody gave a damn about Hogan being selfish then. When pay-per-view buy rates were going through the roof and they were higher than they ever been when he first came in 1994 and scored the highest buy rate immediately with Ric Flair, nobody cared that Hogan was selfish then. People only cared about Hogan being selfish once it became clear that the company was going under and Hogan didn't want to do a clean job to Sting. Now, that whole thing, again, I don't want to get into the Starrcade 97 because we've had that so many different versions of what happened, from Sting wasn't tanned to Hogan's the one who pulled the card. We know that Hogan did it anyway. But there's so many different stories and it all boils down to Hogan anyway when it comes to Starrcade 97. But Bischoff had to give a lot to get as much as he did. In order to achieve his goal of turning a profit from a company that has never turned a profit, for somebody like Bret Hart to sit here and say, he doesn't know shit about wrestling, he doesn't know anything about wrestling, he was just a puppet for Hulk Hogan. The company was losing millions of dollars until Bischoff took over. And in 2 years, they were challenging to be the number one brand. And in 3 years, they were number one. Sounds like you know enough to me. That's as much caping for Eric Bischoff as I can possibly do. And I know I sound like I'm caping for Hulk Hogan a little bit too, but he was the biggest star. You know, he had to be coaxed into things, clearly. But without him, it doesn't work. So I'm not going to completely simp for Hogan, because I know in the long run, he ended up really taking the company to the cleaners and didn't do any favors when it comes to that balance sheet. But Bischoff, man, come on. Y'all got to lay off Bischoff when it comes to who killed WCW. It wasn't Eric Bischoff, man. He did the best he could. He tried, man. He tried harder than anybody that has ever tried to keep a company. He tried harder with WCW and didn't own it than Paul Heyman tried with ECW, and he did own it. And I'll stand on that. Paul Heyman wasn't even working in ECW when the company went out of business. Bischoff was still trying to buy WCW, and he had been forced out of the company twice. Heyman was on Raw, and Tommy Dreamer was running ECW. Bischoff was still trying to get the company, still trying to buy it, when he was forced to stay home. Don't give me that Eric Bischoff killed it. Eric Bischoff tried to save it. He did the best he could. But he's not perfect. He doesn't know everything, you know? And then he wasn't fully in control. He's not the boss. If he kept getting replaced by various people, you know, whether it's either the booking committee or he's getting replaced with Russo and all this kind of stuff, he ain't got no control over that. He had bosses. There was people over him that was making these decisions. That wasn't his call. You know, he did the best he could, I think. And his ego got out of control too. You know, he started acting like he was going to fight Vince McMahon and all this kind of crazy stuff. Ego got out of control. But his ego got out of control because he cared. He was invested. The talent weren't even invested. Most of these guys were trying to go. Half of them didn't want to be there anyway. Nash and Hall only went there because they offered them guaranteed money. How many times have they told you they didn't want to leave WWF? They just wanted more money. So the 3 of the top guys in WCW, Randy Savage didn't want to be there. He wanted to stay, but Vince thought he was too old and kicked him out. Bret Hart didn't want to be there. He wanted to stay in WWF. Vince kicked him out. So you had like how many top guys in WCW that did not even want to be there? And you want to blame Bischoff? Come on, man, get the hell out of here. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, Daddy.